I'm down to 1,000 feet, and I thought I'm not going to make it. I'm going to have to bail out. So I unstrapped, and just as I unstrap, I look over to 3 o'clock, and there's a FW-190 coming at me, and I'm burning on the right side, and so he's coming down at me, and I pull a hard right turn into him, and just as he fires his rockets and guns, and he misses me, and he just keeps going because he saw, I guess, I was burning, and I was done for anyway. So by this time, I'm down to 500 feet, and I'm looking around, and then I think, dumb, you can't bail. You can't belly the thing in. I'm unstrapped, and I don't have time to strap up. I'll kill myself. So off on the wing at about 350 feet, and I let go.
Tower, WWII release you, runway 4 left, wind 040 at 5, clear for takeoff.
Seats high, altimeter 0 eyes, we're clear for takeoff, clear for the airspace. Viper check 2. My burn ramp curve was at 354. So yeah, that's on. Next, picture 16, 15,000, I'll give you some of that. Viper on target.
Today's conversation is with Colonel Joe Petersburg, who's one of the last surviving fighter pilots from the 20th Fighter Group of World War II. Today, we're going to dig into his career, his journey, his path, and it's an incredible conversation that I think you'll really enjoy. But coming this spring, he's going to make a journey to England, partner with Delta Airlines to honor one of his wingmen that didn't make it home. After 80 years from returning overseas, Colonel Petersburg is going to return to England to honor his fallen wingman and his friend. As I've been doing this podcast for a while now, one of my missions is to capture history. This is something that I've watched erode over time. And now, while this isn't the only medium to do it, I think it's an important mission, an important pillar of the Afterburn podcast to try and capture as much of this operational history as possible. If you feel passionate about this type mission, you can support this specific mission and Colonel Petersburg as he returns back to England. There's a link down below where you can join in and support. Sir, thanks for joining me. It is an honor to have you on here. I'm excited for our conversation today. So thank you again for taking the time.
Well, it's my pleasure. My pleasure.
Absolutely. Well, I'd like to kick it off with a bio. And I know I'm only going to scratch the surface on this, but we're going to dig into it today. So Colonel Joe Petersburg, you joined the Army Air Forces at 19 years old, and then eventually went into the aviation piece, flying the P-40, the A-24, and then the legendary P-51 Mustang. And that's just starting out. But you went over to war-torn Europe, and you're part of the 20th Fighter Group, which, as we were talking before we hit record, is, again, humbling for me to be able to talk to you today because my last active duty assignment was out of the 20th Fighter Wing. So a lot of lineage there that I know the guys and gals are still carrying on today. On April 10th, 1945, while escorting hundreds of B-17s near Berlin, you spotted an Me-262, Germany's new secret jet fighter. What followed would make history. As you closed in, guns a-blazing, you scored hits on one of the Luftwaffe's top aces, Walter Schuck, a man credited with over 200 kills. Moments later, though, you would be hit yourself and you crash-landed in enemy territory and were captured. About a week later, you escaped and you fought alongside a Russian tank unit all the way to Berlin, which I definitely want to dig into that as well. You went on to serve 36 years in uniform, flying combat again over Korea, surviving an ejection out of a T-33, living through a rocket attack in Vietnam, and you helped design the command and control systems that helped shape NATO and NORAD's Cold War defenses. You've earned the Distinguished Flying Cross, or you've been awarded, rather, I should say, the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Purple Heart, Bronze Star, and over 30 other decorations. You're a command pilot, former prisoner of war, and a warrior who has literally watched the Air Force evolve from propellers to supersonic jets. Today, I'm honored to be sitting down with Colonel Joe Petersburg, a man, really, you are the giant that we stand upon your shoulders. So, sir, thank you again for taking the time today.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure. I enjoy doing this, and I am particularly interested in the younger generations hearing this story. So they, number one, know what they can achieve, and that their predecessors had achieved it, and it's a goal for them to work for because the future is theirs, and we've done our part, and now it's time for them to do their part.
Absolutely. I'm excited to dig into this today, and I really would like to kind of kick it off. I know, obviously, World War II is going on is going on, and that forces you into the military service. But was this something that you had ever thought about as a kid with flying before, or how did you end up on the aviation side of this?
Well, I had no, other than going to movies back in the 30s and the 20s. Then I love the aviation movies, Dawn Patrol, and several others that were really, really great uh, uh, movies. But that was about it. I was studying to be a priest. I had a vocation to be a priest, and at the time the war started, I was 17 years old at Salvatorian Seminary in St. Nathan's, Wisconsin. Hard at the 12 years that I would have to put in to finally become a priest. And when I heard that Pearl Harbor was bombed, I knew at that time I was be leaving the seminary and joining the armed services. My father was a career a soldier, and I had two brothers that were already in, and I had another few brothers home that will be going in, and I wasn't going to be left behind. So anyway, I decided to leave the seminary, and on my 18th birthday, I took the competitive exam for the aviation cadet program and passed it. And from there, I went through a rigorous flying program and eventually graduated on the 15th of April, 13th of 15th of April of 1944 as a second lieutenant fighter pilot at 19 years old.
That is wild. What was the training like? What was going through your mind in that time span? Because again, as I just with the bio, seeing going from a P-40 to A-24 and reading all the books and hearing the stories, it seemed like it was very fast paced, and you might be showing up to a new squadron that had a different plane, and you would learn it there at the
Yeah,
base with the squadron, which is very different
yeah.
than today.
Well, it was number one. I just sort of came to, I mean, it became natural to me to the flying. It was I soloed the PT-17, the Stearman, in 6 hours. So, and we got 65 hours in it, and then went off to, it was about a month at primary training, and then we went off to basic with the BT-13, and then on to advanced with the Texan, the AT-6, and graduated with that. And the washout rate was pretty high, between 30, depending upon the stage you were in, 30 to 50% washout rate. And when you got to advanced, you really, really got, because there you knew that uh, you had to make it. No mistakes, because you'd be washed out. And so the training in advance was a lot more intense than the earlier part was learning the basics of flying and aerodynamics and things like that. But then when you got to advance, it was tactics, and you know. So it was very interesting, and doing that, and then after graduation, I checked out the P-40, and the way we checked out, we got some backseat landings in the T-6 to make up for that big long nose sitting out there, and then read the manual and then hopped in and took off. And I remember taxiing out and sitting at the end of the runway and hearing those engine roar, and letting loose of the brakes and all that power going down the runway and lifting off. And then I was at Napier Field in Alabama, and we were right on the Gulf Coast, and flying off over to the Gulf was just a beautiful sight. And And then, the P-40 was the primary aircraft. I learned the tactics of the combat. Uh, we were sent. I was after graduation. We went to Fort Myers, Florida, Page Field in Fort Myers, and we had the P-40 there. And there were they had about, they called them RTUs, replacement training units. And when we got to there, we were P-40s, and there were about seven different schools throughout Florida, and they all had P-51s, and we were the only ones with the P-40s. So we had a lot of fun jumping the P-51s and flying the heck out of them and stuff. We could maneuver better than the 51 and the P-40. Of course, it didn't have the power and stuff that the P-51 had, but it was a lot of fun. It was, and we had to go on low altitude navigation missions, 100 feet off the ground through the Florida area, and it was just a lot of fun. The A-24 we use for instrument training. It's a two-seater, and the back seat you'd cover it with a canopy, and then you'd blind. That you get your instrument training there,
So
and that was really a help, really a help when we got overseas, in England particularly.
I imagine with the weather being so
Yeah,
typically
yeah,
bad in
yeah.
England and recovery. Again, I can't think of what it must have been like in that time frame with now what I have navigating around the world and the tools available versus a magnetic compass, maybe
Yeah.
an ADF, et cetera. It's, again, a completely different time frame. What, from when you started learning to fly from day one to when you set foot in Europe, how long was that time span?
When I started flying, it was in September. Yeah, in September of 1943, I started primary training. I graduated in April of 45. I lost two classes because when I was at Montgomery, I was in 44A, and my brother was killed, and I was sent home on a emergency leave to be with my mother and that for a 10-day period. And so when I got back, I was another a month behind. So I was in I ended up in C, and then finished primary and 44C, and then we got to basic and finished basic, and they had no room in the advanced for us, so we were put back a month there. So I ended up in 44D, which was in April of 44 that I graduated. And then I arrived in Europe on the 1st of November, around the 6th of November of 1944.
Wow. What was going
A
through your
little over
mind?
a year and a half.
I mean, yeah, a year from starting to setting
From the
foot
time I
in,
started, yeah.
yeah, in combat is pretty wild. What was going through your mind at the time? Were you excited? Were you nervous?
Oh no, I was excited. I was 19 years old.
Yeah.
I mean, they gave me a 2,000 horsepower engine with 650 caliber machine guns in it, and said, go fight the enemy. And it was, the whole thing was just a big adventure to me. I had no apprehension or anything like that. You're going to live forever when you're 19, and it's the other guy that's always going to get it. You're not going to get
Yeah.
it. So, it was and with that mentality. Later in Korea, when I was a wife and two kids, there was a little different attitude.
Yeah.
you know, you know. But it's we were as you know, a fighter pilot, you're sort of isolated, and you have a completely different culture because, like the bombers, there's a crew and there's an organization inside that aircraft, and you're taking care of each other. Where fighter, you're basically on your own. Yeah, you're watching your buddies in the flight you're in, but that's about as close as it comes. But if you're basically on you with, and you don't see the gore like the guys fighting on the ground. That that really takes bravery. And the bomber pilots, as well, the bomber crews, that really took courage to go into the day after day, and practically suicide missions just about every day during the early part. So it was, and I always thought I just hope I could, work up the bravery that those guys had, that come even close to it, because they were the bravest of the brave, and that's not a cliche that's used loosely. I mean, they were the brave.
Well, you guys are all heroes. Obviously, I do. When you watch these movies or you watch old footage of the bombers, and it's like, well, you're basically going to fly a line and you're going to have 100 of you around it. I mean, as a fighter pilot, if you were an enemy fighter pilot, it's like shooting duck in a barrel. And I know it wasn't that easy, but again, to have the courage to fly the line and stay on it, knowing that you just have to rely upon your crew, your gunners, and your fighter escorts to protect you as best you could. I mean, that's a tough pill to swallow. It's impressive that they did it for sure.
Yeah.
When you got there and arrived at the squadron, can you talk to me about what was the environment like? And what I'm curious about is I imagine guys are flowing in like yourself to augment, or I guess replace bodies as people cycle out.
Yeah, right.
And again, kind of a little bit different, a very different dynamic than what I was used to, right? Where a squadron's training at home, deploys, and everyone comes back, right? Again, apples and oranges there, but I would imagine you got people who are dealing with loss, exhaustion from flying in combat, and now we got a new guy that we got to train and try to keep alive, and I got to rely upon him to do his job to keep me alive.
Yeah.
Those are assumptions on my part, but can you kind of dive into what it was like arriving in that squadron, and then maybe what it was like when you were kind of the seasoned guy having young guys arrive?
Well, as you know, the 20th Fighter Group had P-38s first, and they were converting to P-51s in the summer of 1944, and they had just completed their when I arrived, they had completed the transition from P-38s to P-51s. They were having a difficult time transitioning to the P-51 because of the torque and completely different type of controlling of the aircraft. And to give you an idea, there were 7 of us that came down from Scotland. We landed in Scotland. We were on the Ile-de-France, the troop ship, and then we spent a day in Scotland and down to the 20th. And the day we arrived, we were in a 2.5-ton truck sitting in the back, and came in, and the perimeter road, and the mission was coming back, and so we had to stop and we watched it. And here comes a flight of 4 in, and number 4 man, he comes and he bounces, and all of us P-40s were just holding our breath to see what he's going to do, and he slammed that throttle forward and went right in. That's and we all were yelling no at the same time,
Yeah.
And so we were, going to the P-51 was nothing. I mean, it was just, it was a much, more Cadillac type, going from a Chevy to a Cadillac type of thing, 51 to P-40 to the 51. It's we just got in, read the manual, and checked it over with the crew chief as how to start it, what all the
Yeah.
things were, and took off. And I got about 20 hours in it. I was checked out right away, but we got the 20 hours was taken up with learning the going out practice escort missions, learning what the routine was for a escort mission, and briefings, and low navigation, and learning the capabilities of the enemy aircraft, and learning the space of the hot spots in Germany and France, where you could meet the 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 heavy artillery. So things like that. So, and then I flew my first mission on the 12th of December of 1944.
So what was that first mission like for you?
It was a milk run.
Yeah.
It's disappointing. So it was up in northern Germany. The flak was always steadily, and even just escorting the bombers, you were amongst them too, and you were getting the flak too. But no enemy aircraft and this sort of thing. My
What
first encounter was the first. That was really the one that was exciting,
well
exhilarating.
that was going to be my next question is that first enemy encounter. I would like to dig into that. What was the mission that day? What transpired?
Well, this was a day in which there were I think there were 1,900 bombers and 950 fighters. That's what the 8th Air Force put up. And they were going to about 5 different targets. What happened is, of course, the bombers they would all join up, and they'd be joined up by the time they crossed the channel, and then we would, of course, take off later, and we had joined up, and then we'd have a rendezvous point. Usually, well, when I was there, is in France or the Netherlands, and then we'd join up with the bombers, and then we'd be escorting this whole group, 950 fighters and 1,900 bombers, into one mass until we got to the IP point for the bombers, where they split up to go to their targets, and then we all each had certain designated groups that we would be escorting. So these little groups would be breaking off, and not little. I mean, they were 400 or 500 aircraft in the groups, and so and then we would go up. But anyway, on this mission, we were all. We had gotten to Magdeburg, and just as we were over Magdeburg and starting to split up, we got hit by a couple hundred ME 109s and 190s. Their tactic, the 109, the 109 would come and they'd hit and run. And then the object was they would draw the fighters away from the bombers, and then the FW 190s would come in and chew up the bombers. That was and the thing was that you stayed with the bombers. Our group, the 20th Fighter Group, we were very, very, very insistent that we would stay on the bombers. None of this chasing the aircraft down to the deck and trying to make ace of the day and all that sort of stuff. It was our job was to protect the bombers, and we stayed with the bombers. But anyway. It was just pandemonium. There's all these wings falling, engines falling, parachutes in the air all over the place. And I was more worried about hitting the debris than I was in other aircraft. I mean, the enemy aircraft. Anyway, during this melee, I saw an FW-190 coming, and I did a head-on with them. And so we're going at probably 900 and some odd miles an hour of closing speed. And we're and I'm popping joy, and I see some hits in his left wing, and I see there's cannon shells around his nose, and we're coming along. And unbeknownst to me, I didn't know it, but my flight leader, he was on the 109, the 190's tail, but he couldn't fire because he could have hit me with the head on, you know. So well, I go and I pass about 50 feet under the 190, and he's ready to zap him, and he zapped him as soon as I passed under him, and uh, and that was really an exhilarating experience.
That's, sir, I might say that might be an understatement for an exhilarating experience. I, if I go off like, war movies, and as you described, hundreds of airplanes in the air, right? And you see the chaos that's depicted on film with planes flying through formations, turning it up. In my mind, I'm just like, just the pure ability to deconflict and not hit someone or get hit by a falling wing or piece of wreckage, knowing where your flight lead is or where your wingman is versus another element or another squadron. It seems overwhelming. I mean,
yeah. Well, you do. When it gets down to that, boy, you feel alone because you hope somebody's, you know, saving your ass or is on
yeah.
your ass, protecting you. But it's just chaos. I mean, a lot of discipline goes to pot under those circumstances because everybody's, trying to, number one, survive and to destroy the enemy. And that was I mean, there were dogfights from 30,000 feet down to the deck, and from Berlin all the way back to Magdeburg. I mean, can you imagine that area without and all that activity going on? You know, it was it was interesting.
It was slightly. When you had the intelligence brief for the day, I mean, did you find it at that point in the war? Were you guys caught off guard or by surprises, or when you knew you're going out on one of these escort missions, and it was expect enemy contact, like it usually happened, or were you guys ever caught
No,
off
well,
guard?
but by the time I was there, this is down. We had when Spats got over there. I said, was it Doolittle? Was Doolittle? I think it was, or Spats. I can't remember. One of those two. Anyway, when they came over and took over 8th Air Force, they said this horse crap about staying with the bombers and protect. That we're not going to win the war that way. The only way we're going to win the war is to destroy the Luftwaffe. So the whole concentration was changed to destroying the Luftwaffe, and that meant a lot of fighter sweeps, shooting up aerodromes, and that sort of thing, and uh, and allowing you to leave the bombers and go after the fighters and destroy the fighters and not giving them a free press. And it worked. I mean, the Luftwaffe, by the time I got there, they were very, very uh, 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 frugal with their aircraft going up and attacking, and it was only in certain times. Uh, I mean, we were still hit a lot, but the chances I mean, you had maybe a 1 in 10 chance of being hit by the Luftwaffe on your escort missions because of the I mean, yeah, the Luftwaffe just wasn't coming up after us. They didn't have. I mean, they lost most of their experience, and they're a bunch of young kids flying there too. So it was a completely different situation than it was, early in the war when the bombers were just getting burned. And so by the whole sort of mentality changed too, because air-to-air combat is one thing, but boy, strafing an airfield, and what particularly since the Germans figured out what we were doing, for the defenses of their airfields was just horrific, and the whole thing was one pass and haul ass. That was it, and that was, and unfortunately I didn't pay attention to that sort of stuff. But anyway,
Look at you now, though.
that's what it was, and in fact. General, the first fighter division, they during that period they said that they would count kills on the ground for ace status, uh, and for that period.
And that was because the defenses were so.
It was you were it was really dangerous. I mean, you had a very, very slim chance of making even the one pass without getting hit, some way.
Would this So would this be part of if you're doing an escort mission and then the escort mission was complete and you had a target of opportunity and you roll in on a German airfield or position, or was it? Yeah, deliberate. Hey, we're going to go strike this airfield.
Yeah, our situation was we would escort the bombers to the target, and after they dropped the bombs, if there was no indication of any aerial threat, threat from the Luftwaffe, then one squadron would be cut loose to hit targets of opportunity. That was a type of mission we picked up, and then we also had fighter sweeps, which were, the target was a specific airfield that we were going to destroy. And then we had we had cover. We would pick up a covering, my longest combat day was on the 24th of March of 45. And I got in 9 hours and 45 minutes of combat time that day. I flew 2 missions, flying cover for the crossing of the Remagen bridgehead. And I almost got a Fiesler Storch then. I was down about 500 feet, and I was going down, following the river down and, making the orbits around the crossing place. And I was coming along and I see this little plane coming in. I see it's a Fleecer Storch, and I just whacked my thing up and pulled around, and by the time he was gone when I turned around, I just couldn't get it around fast enough to get him. But
that's why. And at this point, you're obviously in the Mustang.
Yeah.
And for like this type mission, I assume it's just the gun. There's no. Do you have any general purpose bombs, or is there anything that?
We never. The only thing we carried were our ammunition for the guns and the drop tanks. We had we carried always carried the big drop tanks, the paper ones.
Well, and that's, when you say the longest combat or most hours in the day, and I hear 9 hours or so, that's kind of giving me an idea that 4.5, 5 hours, I assume if you don't have to jettison the tanks and you're probably gentle on the throttle there, that's how long you can be out there. That's an incredible
my longest mission, one single mission, was 7 hours and 20 minutes. That was to Czechoslovakia. I was coming back on fumes when I got there, but I made it back okay.
What was that? Was that an escort mission?
Yeah, it was an escort mission to I think it was a Prague, and there's I don't think that's the one that I got that I lost by accident. Another mission from Czechoslovakia, I lost my oxygen, and we always sent somebody back when you had to abort. Somebody would always go back with you, and, like if you had engine trouble or something, in case you had to land, you'd land with them and stuff. But I went back by myself, and I don't know why. But anyway, I but of course I had to get down below 10,000 feet. And I was dead wrecking it. We had no radio aids or anything like that. You did mapping and dead reckoning as far as getting.
If I think about just that, and for all my pilot listeners, I know that like, they're thinking about this, or they have to be thinking about this too. Uh, if we remove all the combat and all the threats from the ground and air from this equation altogether, just the fact of dead reckoning across Europe, in that day and age, like that's
Yeah,
a
yeah.
feat in itself.
When we were training, the training was outstanding that we got. I really, I think, I mean, they would wash you out, boy, if you did.
Yeah.
There was no doubt about the fact that we were the best. When you finished that program, if you were able to make it through the whole thing, you were pretty good.
You alluded to, which I would like to get to Korea eventually, how your mentality might have changed from, 10 foot tall and bulletproof, being a 19-year-old showing up in combat, to having a family. But even in that time span from your first combat mission in December throughout your time in the European theater, did your perspective change, or your thoughts or concerns? Did that change at all? Or is it every day just going out there,
No, no,
sharp
no.
teeth?
Actually, you were pretty damn busy. When you consider you get up around probably 5:30, you have breakfast, go over to briefing will last an hour, then you go over and uh, uh, go to your aircraft, do the pre-flight and all of that, talk to the crew chief, and then go back over your head, what position and and talk with the rest of the flight, and then take off and go on our average mission was 5 hours and a half, and go on a 5 6 hour mission and come back, and the first thing you do when you get back, you go to the intelligence officer and you sit down. He gives you a shot of whiskey, and then he starts debriefing you for for an hour, and then you get ready. You finish that thing, and then the next stop is over to the club where we can all tell all our lies and all our war stories and
I'm glad
stuff
it hasn't changed.
like that.
Yeah.
And then by that time the day is pretty damn shot. And then when you consider you got letters to write and all that sort of stuff, you didn't have much time. And I was on my last 10, 15 missions were. Let me see. I flew the 30th, the 31st, and every day in April till the 10th of April. So that was 12 straight days of flying every day.
There's no
Uh,
time to think.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah. And then it was, I flew 49 missions, which amounted to 260 or 70 hours of combat time in 4 months. So
Wow.
that
Looking
was.
back on it, is there one mission in that time span? I don't want to get to April 10th just yet, but prior to April 10th, looking back on that, you're particularly proud of, whether it be for the accomplishments and the success of that day, or overcoming some kind of challenges in that flight? Is there one in particular
Yeah.
that stands out in your mind?
Well, there's several that do, but probably the best one is that's what I got my nickname. But anyway, it was a fighter sweep, uh, and we fled it forward. We were off on our own, and we come across this. Well, we got my flight leader and I got a locomotive, and it was down in sort of a little ravine, and we were coming over the top and the ravine. And we had to just pump, just a little quick a burst and then pull up, or you'd get go into the other side. But that and then I destroyed. I damaged a factory. My flight leader was shot. He got hit in the coolant, and he had to bail out. He was a POW, and but I kept strafing. I uh, did a lot of damage to a factory, and then I destroyed a bunch of the railroad equipment. I think I was destroyed 6 switching towers and several other things that made the trains run. And I got back, and they said, "Hey, well, here comes the strafing kid," and I got the name of the strafing kid, the nickname.
And on that flight, your flight lead was shot down, or your wingman was shot down.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, what a when I hear that, just what a wild time. And again, probably not the right phrasing for that.
Yeah.
But to think of your wingman gets shot down, but you keep on pressing.
Oh, yeah.
And with the old adage is, the worst spot to eject is over the spot you just bombed. But you're in the hornet's nest there, and you keep going at it.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I had another minute. That was one of my friends. That was another. I was on the Dresden raid, the big Dresden raid, and it was one of these things when they've been abolished. Our squadron was cut loose, and I was in the flight with Major Goddard. There were just 3 of us in the flight. Major Goddard was lead, and then Lieutenant Leon was number 3 position, and I was I was the number 3. I was the element leader, but the number 4 man had aborted, and Leon was number 2. And we were about 10,000 feet. We saw this Army vehicle going down the road, and Goddard says we're going in, and so he rolls over, and I see Leon is really close, tucked in, and they go in, and I see, and I'm I got a good distance behind them, and I see the Goddard, he barely gets pulls out, and Leon just right in, doing probably 450, and he's gone. And I went on and got the truck, and that was it. We hung around a while. We got it. Said, "Well, we'll look around." And there was no possibility of him surviving anything there. So.
How common was that in your squadron? That when everyone walked out the door that morning, that not everyone was walking back in.
Yeah. Well, there's one mission I wasn't flying on it, but 2 of my buddies were killed on that mission. Lieutenant Smith and Lieutenant Solo, both killed, and then Lieutenant Pettit. He got a 109. We were sort of a little clique of friends, and then a couple of weeks later, Pettit was flying by an aircraft, and he went in my aircraft. So in a period of about a couple of weeks, I lost three buddies there.
Yes.
So I went over with 7 guys in that truck, that we had 100% count. This is, when people say, "Oh, well, you were there at the end of the war," well, we had 100% casualty rate. We had one killed in training. We had 3 KIAs, and then there were three of us that were prisoners of war. Well, all shot down in POWs. So,
yeah, it wasn't a walk in the park. It's wild that that's even a thought that someone's like, "Oh, well, it's the end of the war, so not much to worry about." So on the flip side of, we kind of went down the mission that stood out you're really proud of. Alternatively, is there one that stands out in your mind that was incredibly that was more difficult than the others? And again, that's I mean, all of these are like honestly unfathomable.
Well, see,
Me to
it
think of
depends upon, like on one mission, it was all, we came back, the flight came back, and it was all, England was sucked in, and the flight leader said, well, we're going to drop down to 1,000 feet. If we don't break out, we'll go up. We only had about 10 minutes of fuel, 10, 15 minutes of fuel left, and we'll go up, pull up and bail out. So we go down, and I go beyond 1,000 feet. I go down to about 300 feet, and I see this little opening, and it's a Lancaster base, and it has FIDO. Do you know what FIDO is?
I don't.
The fog dispersal. They used
Okay.
to burn the spots along the side. The bomber
Yeah.
bases,
Okay.
and then they'd lift the fog, and it'd be about 150, 200-foot ceiling. And I saw the end of that runway, and I was doing probably about 190 or so, and the letdown. And boy, I just pulled everything back, and I went and I spiked that on that end of the runway, and used up the whole runway before I could stop. I must have hit that 160, 70 miles an hour. I must have hit that.
I think it's important to note for those who aren't quite familiar with instrument landings. Today, while we do have planes that can land in zero visibility and not ever see the runway, most of our instrument landing systems, the lowest it can take you down to is 200 feet above the ground. So when I hear you say it bumps the fog up to 150 feet, 200 feet, that's spicy. And I'll just
yeah. Particularly, we were in an area where they had a lot of factories, and they had the big old smokestacks going up in the air. So it was a little hard, but for some reason or other, I lived through it.
Oh man, what? I mean, again, there's so much here that we can dive
But
into.
there was a lot of the thing is, you were flying, so, and I'm sure that there were a lot more that I would. I did. I landed in France one time to look for my brother. My oldest brother, he was in the infantry, and he was in the invasion to southern France, and so I knew generally where his unit was, so I landed at an airfield close by, but I never did find him. So anyway, I take off, and I just get airborne, and my engine quits, and bang, bang, bang. I switched to tanks in a hurry. I forgot that to switch my tanks, and I was, empty on the I think I was on the fuselage tank. But
oh my gosh.
anyway, and then I fixed it, and the engine kicked in right away before I had hit the ground, and so went on my merry way. Little things like that happening, and those are, lots of things. I've escorted guys back that were boarding. Like I said, you usually send somebody back, and I'd be back with them and go back, and we'd have a hairy time with the weather. I know, and a couple of times bringing them back into Belgium airfields. It was, but it was a. I don't know. It was exciting. We had good, camaraderie and lots of fun. The average age was about 23, and our group commander, Colonel Montgomery, he was 28 years old. So we were a bunch of young guys doing a job.
Yeah, that's a great way of summarizing it. And I can see the excitement, just looking back of like what my mentality was like even just a few years ago and how to be. But I might still describe if my single engine fighter engine shut off more than just it was just kind of one of those things. So I do appreciate the description. it's just one of those happenings. That's, again, I would go with that's a pretty spicy day for the average Joe, and you just kept on going, which I love. That's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to jump to April 10th. I think this is a good segue here, and if you can walk me through, I mean, really from the start of the mission and then what transpired on that day, and I think that'll be a great launching pad into a little bit deeper of a discussion.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, the 10th of April of 1945, my 49th mission, and it was a normal routine of, but we had a large force again. It was right around 2,000 bombers, and again about 900 some odd fighters, and took targets in Berlin, Brest, Magdeburg, and Oranienburg, which was our target. We were escorting the bombers going to Oranienburg. So we all go in as a mass, and it was probably about 50 miles from Magdeburg, and then they started splitting up to go to their individual targets. Well, in our group, we had about 450 B-17s, and there were, I think, about 240 fighters going to Oranienburg. So,
can I ask one question with that? How long did it take to? I mean, you hear that number of planes to get 240 fighters airborne, to get 450 bombers airborne, and then you guys all pushing across the line together. How long did that take?
Well, of course, the bombers would take off well in advance. It wouldn't take us long. The fighters we were taking off in formation, and the squadron would form right above the airfield, and then the various squadrons would be going depending upon their takeoff and headed towards the rendezvous. And by the time we got to the rendezvous point with the bombers, we'd be all together. But I don't know how the hell the bombers did this. They're 150, 60 miles an hour, and and when I was there, of course, during the worst winter, we had to take we had to get in, I think it was 4 hours of late training a month. We had to put in that, and that was really required. And because the weather was really, really terrible. I mean, could you imagine being in the soup trying to join up with 400 or 500 other bombers? So
that's what I think of. I mean, just again, all these things are amazing to me, and the things that get taken for granted. Like, and today I think of data link, radars, which it's still very challenging to fight in the weather, to rejoin in the weather, especially when we're talking at this scale. So even just basically going to work, for a lack of a better phrase here, was incredibly risky, incredibly challenging, just getting everyone to the starting point. It's just amazing.
So anyway, that was the and we got over Oranienburg, and the bombers just were in the process of dropping their bombs, and I was flying high cover about 5,000 feet above the bombers, and I was right around 30,000 feet. The bombers were about 25,000. And I saw this swarm of ME-262s coming in and start hitting the bombers. And there were about 7 of them. And I latched on to this one that I saw going in towards a B-17 and rolled over and started at it. And he blew the B-17 and then went off and was going into another one. And I had throttle full open. I almost hit compressibility going down. For some reason, I looked at the airspeed indicator when I was going through around 4,000 feet, something like that, and it was doing 420 indicated, and that equates to about 550 ground speed. So, and I could feel the control. But anyway, I come barreling into him and to get his left engine, and he starts burning in smoke, and he immediately rolls over and starts down to the deck. And I'm chasing, and now I'm starting to lose the advantage I had from the altitude, the speed advantage. And of course, he was porpoising through the bombers. That was his deck. A lot of this came later that we became friends, and we talked tactics and all that. But anyway, he was porpoising. What he'd do is, he'd be coming down fast, and then he hit the bomber, and then he'd pull up and lose speed, and then they'd come down again. And that's how he is sort of going through the formation. Anyway, he headed towards it, and then about probably 3,000-4,000. There was an undercast, about 3,000-4,000 feet, and he disappears into that. I said, "The hell with it! I'm not gonna chase him into the clouds. I won't find him." And but he was burning, and the left engine, and smoking pretty bad. And I don't know if he went in or not. I mean, at the time, I never even thought of putting in a claim. I didn't see him blow up or anything like that. So anyway, I look over and I see this airfield just loaded with aircraft, and got down to grass cutting level and came in and really hit him by surprise and knocked out a couple of. Anyway, I went ahead. I made not the one pass and haul ass. I made about 5-6 passes, and on the last pass, I was after a FW 200, which is the Condor, big 4-engine, one of Hitler's fleet of commercial type of aircraft. And as I was coming down, I felt the thud, and I blew the Condor. It blew, and then was coming off the target, and I felt another thud, and I started getting oil over the windscreen, and I made it up to 10,000 feet. And there I had to make a decision which way to go, east or west. The Russians were fighting in Berlin, and that was the closest. And Magdeburg, we were briefed that our troops were fighting in Magdeburg. So that was about 80 miles away, and I had made up to 10,000, and there was some fiddling around with the mixture and the prop and all that, so that you could get a little out of your engine. And I wish I remembered what it was, but it was a fairly complicated thing. But anyway, I did get a little out, so I headed towards Magdeburg. And I get over Berg, which is a little town east of Magdeburg. And I'm down to 1,000 feet, and I thought, I'm not going to make it. I'm going to have to bail out. So I had strap. And just as I had strap, I look over to 3 o'clock, and there's a FW 190 coming at me. And I'm burning on the right side. And so he's coming down at me, and I pull a hard right turn into him, and just as he fires his rockets and guns, and he misses me, and he just keeps going because he saw, I guess, I was burning, and I was done for anyway. So by this time, I'm down to 500 feet, and I think, oh crap, I'm too low to bail out. I'm going to have to belly this thing in. So I'm looking around. Of course, it's middle of seconds, going on in your head. And I'm looking around, and then I think, shit, dumb, you can't bail. You can't belly the thing in. I'm unstrapped, and I don't have time to strap up. I'll kill myself. So off on the wing at about 350 feet, and I let go. And of course, you're supposed to go on the right side to the torque will throw you away from the aircraft. Go on the left side, the torque's going to throw you into the aircraft. Well, that's published. I hit the horizontal stabilizer with my right knee, and I pull the ripcord, it opens, and I swing once, and I hit the ground hard.
Wow.
So I'm down and laying down, chute covered me, and I said, I got to get up and see what in the hell's going on around here and where I am, what I could do. So I get up, and I'm in the middle of a farmer's field. I mean, acres of nothing, not even any trees around. And about 50 yards away, there's a group of people running towards me with pitchforks, and all of they're out. This is April. They're out in the farm, out in the fields working, and they're running like hell towards me. I think, well, this is going to be it, I guess. And they're about 20 yards away, and I hear this rumbling behind me, and I look over, and there's this Luftwaffe sergeant comes tearing up on a motorcycle, hops off, pulls out his Luger, pops a couple shots in the air, and holds and puts his hand up, telling the crowd, telling him, I assume in German. I could understand a little German. I had 2 years of it in the seminary, so that came in handy. And anyway, they said I'm his prisoner, and that knock it off. And then about that time, the bucks from the town, the burgomaster, the chief of police, and a couple other old guys about 35, 40 years old, and come out. So they talked the sergeant into bringing me into town, into one of the buildings, I guess the local, you know, official building. And said we go in there, and they start questioning me, and the chief of police, he's just pissed at me so bad he pulls the Luger out, puts it at my head. He wants to blow me on the spot. The sergeant and he has a big discussion, and finally, there's people gathering outside the building, yelling and screaming and all that sort of stuff. And he said, "We're going." And so he takes me, puts me on his motorcycle. It was what did have a sidecar. Set me on the back, and off we go. There was a big base there at Berg. It was a Luftwaffe testing, and they were testing a lot of new equipment there. Anyway, he takes me down there, and I'm put in the local jail there. And then after an hour or so, a couple of guys in long black coats come in, and I just assumed they're Gestapo, and I guess they were. And I had about 6 hours of questioning, and intense questioning, but nothing physical, nothing uh, other than that. The main thing they were trying to find out was what mission I was on, because we had this group with 5 different targets, and then I'm bailed out over the Magdeburg area, so they assumed that I was part of that raid, and uh, I just let them think that, and I don't know what good it was to it, but anyway. Uh, uh, I was in Oranienburg and shot down there, and I was involved with the ME-262s, and so then I'm there for another 2 nights, and each night the RAF is bombing the airfield, and I'm in this big bomb shelter with about 30 or 40 Germans while the bombs are going over very, very interesting situation, very uncomfortable with all of them staring at me, but anyway.
I mean, very, very interesting that they brought you in there with them. Do you think the Gestapo, you said they're kind of trying to figure out what mission you're on, which I wonder if that was like for retribution. but like versus trying to collect intelligence about, strength of forces, capabilities, like
Yeah.
things you think they'd want to know the answers to so that they could, defend against the next attack or conduct an offensive attack themselves. But you think they're just kind of along the lines of,
they were just fishing. They were, the war was coming pretty close to an end by now, and they weren't as as intense as they were, when they thought they were winning.
yeah, they
So I,
knew.
like the guard at the jail when I left. He wanted me to give him a note saying I treated him well, which I did. He did treat me well, so.
Yeah, they knew.
So
Sorry. So you're sitting in the bomb shelter. The bombs are going off
yeah.
around you. Again, awkward situation.
So anyway, it was on the 13th of April. They decided to send me down to Stalag 8, which was a British POW camp. It was only about probably a hour, not even an hour ride on train from where I was, from Berg to where the camp was. And I'm standing out there waiting with the guard, waiting to get on the train, and one of the railroad men come over and they said, "Hey, do you know your president died?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Yeah, Roosevelt died yesterday, 12th of April." And he said, "Here," he handed me a little bottle of stuff. He said, "Take a swig." And it was schnapps, and I wasn't a drinker. Wow. But that sort of woke me up or whatever,
Yeah, right.
took me out of my days. Anyway, I went, ended up at Stalag 8, and there was I think about 10,000 uh, British troops in that camp, but they had all been evacuated, headed towards the east. And there was about 100 of them left. And so I spent the night there, and then the next morning we get rostered out and we start a march back to Berlin. So we were on a forced march back to Berlin, and it was just a complete uh, pandemonium, chaos. Thousands of refugees going east and thousands going west, and Wehrmacht retreating from the front, Wehrmacht supporting the front, and traffic just snarled, and guys with uh, Army Wehrmacht going up and down on motorcycles trying to get some sediments, and then we get strafed by some P-47s a couple of times over there. Of course, they're after the Army vehicles and stuff. They didn't know where, but we survived that. And anyway, yeah, it was taking us probably 6 days when we ended up in Luckenwalde, which is just outside of Berlin. And it was a Russian POW camp. It was loaded with Russians. And I was there for about 5, 6 days, and then decided the security was very lax, and basically just going out onto the fence when the spotlight wasn't on it, and headed towards Berlin.
Well,
And
how did you get through the fence? I mean, now I envision here the spotlights in the movie where
yeah,
it's going along the fence and you
every
hide.
5 minutes the
Yeah.
spotlights are coming around, and so we just lifted up the fence, and it was a simple thing to do. So, and so we get out and head towards Berlin, and I'm about probably 5 miles away from the camp, and I hear this rumbling, and get out of the ditch. I was walking down along the ditch alongside the road, and I get out the ditch, and I see it's a Russian tank unit coming down the road. I waved down the lieutenant. I could speak a little German, and the Europeans, they could speak 3 or 4 different languages. So, and I have no idea. And then plain old sign language. I don't know how I communicated, but I was able to communicate with them and let them know I was wanted to get back. And he said, hop on. So I hopped on the tank and we headed towards. He said the target was Wittenberg on the Elbe, and so we went first through Jitterbug, had a big skirmish in Jitterbug, and then off towards Wittenberg, and probably another 5 or 6 days with them. And now it's coming. This is right around D-Day now. Uh, I, I didn't know, I didn't know it. In fact, I just realized maybe probably 6 months ago that I was on a tour with a bunch of vets, and we were all asked, where were you and what did you think when D-Day, I mean V-Day came along? And I didn't know. I didn't even know it happened. But then I remembered that right around that time, the Russians had a big banquet. They stopped at a farm and built a big banquet table. There were a lot of uh, uh, toasts to the Americans. Me, I was the only one there, and I got never so drunk in my life, and never before or since. But anyway, it was a big and I bet they were celebrating D-Day, the D-Day, V-Day, Victory in Europe Day. What is it, 8th of May, 8th of May,
Wow.
something like that. Anyway, we're bivouacked outside of Wittenberg, and the U.S. Army patrol came across the Elbe to meet the Russians, and they met them, and they were sort of near the last 2, 3 from that banquet on. They were sort of keeping an eye on me, or a little more security. That wasn't as free to move around as I was before, and they had me sort of hidden away when the Army patrol came along. But the Army, the Master Sergeant in charge of the patrol, he saw that flying suit and he knew it was an American flying suit, and I was hidden behind a tent someplace, and he said, who's that? And the lieutenant, the Russian lieutenant and the sergeant got into some kind of a discussion. I have no idea what they were talking about, and they were a little angry at times. And anyway, it ended up where I went back with the sergeant. And they were stationed at Halle, and they were out doing patrols, mop-up operations. So I stayed with them for a couple of days and doing that, and until we got back to the headquarters. And when I got back there, uh, didn't seem to be anything going on there, so I decided to take off and head back towards the west. So I say goodbye, and I just take off and walking back towards the west, and I'm probably 5, 6 miles away from Halle, and I see the C-47 parked in a grass field, and outside of it there were a bunch of probably 15 or so emaciated corpses, almost people in striped uniforms, striped dress, And, I went up to the pilots, the 2 lieutenants. They were pilot and co-pilot. I said, what's going on? He said, oh, those are some political prisoners who were bringing back to Paris, who were liberated. And of course, they had no idea of what the Holocaust was all about.
Right.
Neither did we. Had no idea what was going on, and it was such a shock to me. And then we got in and they were, they were just as living dead. It was just a real shock to see humans in that sort of state, and it really affected me then.
I want to talk about fighting with the Russians. I want to talk about leaving them, but I think maybe real quick, when did you fully comprehend like the Holocaust and what had transpired, and obviously the plane that you should...
Actually, except for this little, and I didn't know at that time. I don't know why these people were like that. Neither did the pilots. And the whole thing, well, they're just being returned or something. We didn't know anything about it, and it was well after the war that we started learning anything about it. It was not published, internally into the Army, I guess. The guys were coming across all the camps, and they were being able to find out. I mean, they were finding out really detailed information. But even when I got back, we got married, and I was on honeymoon for 60 days and all that. So we hadn't much time to worry about world affairs.
Right. Yeah, you were done with that for the time being.
But anyway, we got to Paris, and I got stabbed and deloused and back under control. And at that time, the Army had set up a bunch of camps. They called them by names of cigarettes: Lucky Strike, Chesterfield, Old Gold, and things like that. I was at Camp Lucky Strike just outside of Le Havre. And from there, with several little detours, I ended up headed back to the States and landed in New York on the 1st of June, and got home and to Milwaukee and number one project was to get married to my fiancée Josephine, who I named my aircraft after.
Love it.
And in the process of doing this and doing the paperwork, I found out I had to get my mom's permission to get married because I hadn't turned 21 yet.
Wow. And all this before 21. That's phenomenal. I mean, just recapping that last month there in Europe, obviously engaged in combat. You shoot down one of the leading German aces, which you mentioned it to you later, befriended, and you guys had discussions. I'd like to hear about that. You get captured, you become a German POW, and then you end up fighting alongside the Russians all the way through VE Day. Do you think, so one, I want to hear about fighting with the Russians, but as you were kind of talking to the temperament changed with the Russians, or at least that was your read on the room, which, given what we know about history today, it seems very logical that they were trying to gain as much territory as they possibly could. And it didn't seem like they were going to give you up had that one Army sergeant not recognized you in amongst the group there.
Yeah. Well, you got to remember, this is the time that the Potsdam conference was going on, and then Patton was shooting off his mouth about we should have stopped. We should have kept going, and things were getting a little tense. And I'm sure that probably they were, I don't know, not a hostage or anything, but a bargaining thing or whatever. That's a possibility, or maybe it's just they just didn't want to. They liked me so much they didn't want to get rid of me.
Yeah, it was your award-winning personality. That's
maybe they found out that I shot down Shuck, because Shuck's 198 kills in the Me-109 were against the Russians.
Really? Yeah, it would.
He was flying out of Petsamo in northern Finland across Murmansk, and most of his skills were Russian.
When did you meet Shuck?
I met Shuck on the 18th of May of 2005 in Vista, California, at the Wendy's restaurant with the meeting, the monthly meeting of the Old Pilots Association.
No, okay. How was that?
Oh, that was great. We were there to basically a British, a Canadian artist that did a mural of me shooting down Walter, and we were there to sign that. And Walter was there to visit one of his mates from Petsamo, who had migrated to the States back in the 50s, and so it was doing that, and he just was. We just took to each other right away, and he was just a really gentleman and unassuming. I never think that he was one of the top aces. They called him two things: the eagle of the North, because of his eyes. I mean, he could see aircraft 3-4 minutes before anybody else. He'd always be able to spot them, and then he was also called the Knight of the North because of his chivalry and his concern about not only his own pilots that were killed and his friends and so on, but the enemy pilots too. He he had great respect for those, and he was, and those guys, they were up. They knew nothing of what was going on in Germany, and they were a bunch of wild. I mean, he'd tell me about their part. In fact, just about every one of his commanders were up for court-martial at some time for disobeying the rules of Nazism or whatever, and they never were prosecuted for it because they were all top aces, you know,
Yeah.
and there were no way that the German public, because these were all guys that were heroes, they were plastered all over their magazines and stuff, and so it was just a, they were out, and Walter's favorite music. He loved jazz, and his favorite jazz musician was Louis Armstrong, and his favorite singer was a British singer. I forget the name. Marilyn.
Yeah.
She was and in fact, the last time we were together, we were in Wendover, England, and he was able to meet her in person. She
Wow.
was there where we were. So it was great. Anyway, he became more or less part of the family. We would go to Germany and do shows with him, and he would come over and do shows with us, and we would be sitting at the table together with our books and stuff and prints, and there would be a line a couple blocks long waiting to get these two guys to sign their stuff. So it was, and my great granddaughters called me Papa Joe, and they call Walter Papa Walter. So.
Is he still alive today?
No, he passed in 2015. He was 4 years older than I.
Okay.
So
I mean, just
at the time we met for the first time, he was 24 and I was 20. So.
Yeah, talk about a full circle story there, to say the least. What was going through your mind? What was the experience like going from flying a Mustang to then all of a sudden next to a Russian tank column, fighting alongside the Russians, as now coming from the other direction? What was going through your mind?
It was weird. There's a couple of things. they had a lot of Lend-Lease, and they had a lot of international trucks, if I remember, and they were all driving them in first gear because they had stripped all the other gears. you know, they were they were not very mechanically inclined, or the average soldier, in the ground, and they were a rough bunch, but they were, there was a lot of camaraderie there, and we had a lot of fun. They were, taking every chance they could to have fun, and uh, and there were some crazy ones too. Like when we got to Jitterbug, we came across this complex, apartment complex, and it was a square buildings with the interior was sort of a park sort of thing, and the patrol leader, big old Russian and rough guy, and we went in, and we start going through the rooms, and he stops at this one room, really nicely furnished, beautiful stuff, and he tells us, out, get out of the room. And he goes into the center with his burp gun, and he destroys everything in that room.
Wow.
And I'm sitting there watching it, and I'm thinking, standing there watching it, and I'm thinking, gee, what have I got myself into here?
Wow.
It was really, and he was laughing his head off as he was doing it. Yeah. And so and then one time there was a guy on the side of the road that he was right. He had a bike, and it was uh, broke. He tried to fix it and stuff, and I saw him, and I went down. When I was a kid, I lived on my bike. I could probably take it apart and put it back together blindfolded.
Right.
So I knew bikes. So I thought I'd go and see if I could help it. And took me about 10 minutes of something to do with the sprocket. And I got a bunch of hugs and kisses, and then he went on his way. There's just little incidents like that. And so
Yeah. Wow.
there was a lot of rough stuff and a lot of humanity involved.
Yeah. Talk about it again. I'm just trying to envision what that could be like. Just again, going from flying in formation, dogfighting, to the next minute walking alongside a Russian tank. That's quite the swing, to say the least. So.
Yeah, it was fun.
Would you want to go back?
It was interesting. The big old tank.
You say fun. Would you want to go back and do it again?
Oh, and I don't think so. If I could be guaranteed, the same results, I probably would.
Fair enough. Well, obviously we've spent a lot of time here. I do appreciate your time digging into this, and I don't want us to miss out on a lot of the rest of your career, but I was wondering if we could talk just a little bit about your time in Korea and Vietnam. I know you went on to fly jets. You've ejected and survived an ejection, so 2 bailouts in this. Again, you've had quite the career.
Yeah. I also sat under an atomic bomb of 20 kilotons and as a guinea pig, and with it exploding in Camp Desert Rock in Las Vegas in 1954.
All right. Well, maybe we should just go right there, because how was that?
Well, that was an experience. That's number one. I was at Tyndall. And there were 4 of us. The message came on. They wanted volunteers to participate in the atomic bomb testing and there were 4 of us volunteered. And Las Vegas, what's better than that? So we go there, and we check in at Nellis, and we're waiting for the thing to go by. And the weather was really bad, and it was delayed for 9 days. So we would sleep all day and then hit the clubs all night. And finally the day came that they were going to actually do it. The weather was okay, everything was fine, so we could get loaded with a bunch of. Most of them were Army troops. We were the only Air Force, I think, there. And we get loaded in this truck, or maybe we got in the wrong truck.
Yeah.
Anyway, we get in this truck and go out to Camp Desert Rock, and there's a bunch of trenches about 6 feet, 7 feet deep, and they give us a helmet and a GI blanket, and we all had our own sunglasses, and they say, well, you're going to be down in this trench, and you scoot all the way down, and they pointed to the tower, and there was a tower over there with a big thing on top of it, and they said, we're going to explode this a 20 kiloton bomb and see what happens.
How far away is this tower?
The tower was probably about 1,500 yards, something like that. Wasn't very far. And then so we're all down hutched, and then the bomb goes off, and I feel like all the marrow in my bones is being sucked out of me. The sound is just I can't explain the sound. And the wind and everything that was going with it, and I had my blanket over my head with my sunglasses on and my eyes closed, and still a bright light, and it was really a Twilight Zone type of a feeling. You just felt out of body. And then everything settles down, and they come by and they say, well, just stay down here you're going to stay in their trench for a little while. So we stayed in the trench for I think it was about 30 minutes. And then they roused us all out and walk up to ground zero. And a bunch of guys with Geiger counters walking around taking our readings and putting it down on a little card, which mysteriously disappeared from my records in 1972.
Wow. Wow. I mean, did they ever tell you what the objective of the test was for you guys? I assume to see if you could survive.
No, they never did. I guess they just, I hate that we could survive being that close to the actual bomb, and how many, or either not, or maybe how many Roentgens we would, whether there would be a fatal dose or a sickening dose or whatever like that. I'm sure that the scientists had made sure that we wouldn't be in really any danger.
I'm sure.
like the Agent Orange people.
Yeah, right. It's like, no, this is fine. They got you covered. Wow.
So,
I was just like even thinking, just as you described.
But you've seen these newsreels. I mean,
well,
back then there were newsreels where the wind, they're blowing over. They had houses and stuff like that. They're just, well, that's where I was.
All the air being sucked out. I would imagine how loud it would be, and then not to mention all the radiation that I mean, I assume would be around that area, but maybe not. That's wild. That's unbelievable. So I guess, I mean, surviving an atomic bomb, I guess, makes ejecting from an aircraft pale in comparison. So, I mean.
Oh, ejection was something else. It was all manual back then.
Yeah, what led to the ejection? It was a T-33, correct? That
it was a T-33, the P-80 and or the F-80 and the T-33 had a design, I think, deficiency, and the fuselage tank is right behind the cockpit, and it had a tendency to leak, and you know where the plenum chambers are. So you get some siphoning out of that tank into the plenum chamber, that's a fire.
Yeah.
And anyway, I was just doing what do you call it, a weather check for the unit I had. We supported the weapons controller school doing intercepts and stuff like that. So I was doing the weather check. I was going through about 15,000 feet, and I got a warning light. So I called it. I make a 180 and started back and told. I pulled the throttle back, and the light sort of blinked and went out. And by the time I got around, and I got a full red light, and I stopped, cocked the throttle, and it went out for a little while, and then I came back full force, and I decided I'm gonna have to punch out because I had a flare in the plenum chamber, and that's what the SOP was. That you get a solid light there, you go, and so anyway, left and right handles, lift up the armrest and punch off the canopy, and then you punch off, then you're setting on a 37 millimeter cannon shell, and that blows your seat, and you and everything attached to the seat, and you go out and you're tumbling, and so you have to release yourself. So you release yourself and separate from the seat, and you're tumbling along with the seat, and you have to figure out when to pull the ripcord because you don't want your chute tangled up with the seat. So you make some quick calculations there, and you pull the ripcord. Everything went fine. The training was fine. Everything went fine. I did everything right, and the chute opened. And the only thing is, I was in the weather, and I thought everything was just waiting to go down. And I break out at about 4,000 feet, and there I'm at about a 90-degree swing. So I grab the lanyards and get settled down and then land. And I was just outside of Eglin in the swamps, and I landed in the middle of the swamps outside of Eglin.
I mean, yep, you've done more than most people have done in an entire lifetime. So that is incredible. How, looking back, going from being a young guy, World War II, I mean, really, I would say the really beginning of the evolution of the aviation age. I know it started obviously before that, but by the time the end of your career, you're working with NATO, you're onboarding mobile command systems. Just how vastly the landscape changed in your career in the military.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that when you look back and just see all the stuff you were exposed to and how fast things changed?
Well, yeah, my just as interesting as the different types of jobs I had. I mean, every completely new. You go in. Yeah, I mean, when I got back from Korea, and I was at, I saw what the tone was. I said, "There's no future in the Air Force in flying, just flying," and I went into command and control because that was a big thing then. If they finally figured out they have to have some kind of a organized system to control battles and this sort of stuff. So I got into command and control, and that's what I was for the remainder of my career. I still flew, but I still my primary job was command and control, and which was, I thought, the big turning point in my career, where I had some very interesting jobs with that.
Yeah, I definitely can see that. I would like to highlight Delta Airlines. Actually, the connection, that's kind of how we connected here. And I know
Yeah.
coming up in the spring, you have a big trip, and they're a big part of it, and I would like to discuss a little bit about what's going to happen in the spring, why it's important, and your involvement there.
No. Well, all I can know is last April I was there, and I was at Duckworth, Duckford, with all the guys there and the gals, and they gave me a ride. It was the 80th anniversary. 10th of April, I was there, the 80th anniversary of my shoot down, and I never got to do a victory roll for Walter. So they graciously let me fly with them in the P-51, and we went over Kings Cliff and did a high-speed run where the runway should have been, but it was all overgrown. But then did a victory roll. And then after that, they said that I had to come back next year. I promised to come back the following year to get a flight in the Spitfire, which I always really wanted to do. So I think I'm going to get a ride in the Spitfire when I go back.
Oh, that'll be incredible. Well, I think it's amazing to be able to connect. I know that's going to be an amazing experience here, hopefully in the very near future. I know Delta, every year I see, and I got friends who fly for Delta that they go over and commemorate D-Day, and they bring a lot of veterans over, which I think is an incredible thing for them to do. So, so before we wrap up here, like looking back, I'm sure you have some words of wisdom, some thoughts, something that I haven't asked yet that you think would be important to share with the listener, to share with young people. Again, as you kind of look back and reflect on things.
Well, my favorite, I think most important as far as my life is concerned was just do your best. Whatever your endeavor is, do your best. And then in order to do your best, you have to keep your complete attention on what you do and zero in on completing that particular mission. You cannot let things like fear or apprehension or anything outside get into the way. You just keep yourself focused on what you're doing and what you're trying to achieve, and make sure you're doing whatever you can to achieve that objective. And I think you'll succeed in whatever you undertake if you do that. From a morality standpoint, I think that when I was a kid, and I knew that my upbringing convinced me that there are things that I'm worth dying for. My God, my family, and my country. And I feel that unless somebody believes in something strong enough to where they will give their life for it, life is hardly worth living. You have to believe in something that you were willing to die for. And I think I met the challenge for country, and I think that I'd make it. I would come out well by doing what I advocate for God or my family.
I have no doubt. Sir, thank you for your time today. Thank you for your service. Thank you for paving the way for so many of us. It was truly an honor to be able to sit down with you today and talk and learn just a little bit about your story. So thank you again.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for the fighter pilots. Just be a badass.
I love it.
Right.
It's a perfect way to wrap this up. So I love it. The mentality hasn't changed. So thank you, sir.
Okay. Thank you.